I started out as a young Earth creationist Christian fundamentalist. In the sheltered environment of carefully filtered misinformation that I grew up in, if you had asked me if my religion was a faith-based position, I would have told you no, my religion was an evidence-based conclusion. I believed that there were two arguments that made my religion unquestionable, to the point that anyone who rejected my faith was either woefully ignorant of the facts, or they were deliberately deluding themselves because they wanted to live in sin as if there was no God. The first of these pillars upon which my certainty rested was Answers in Genesis apologetics. I sincerely believed that the science showed that there had been a single worldwide flood approximately 4,000 years ago, and that you had to be either stupid or pig-headed to say otherwise.
You know, if Noah's flood was true, you'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And you know what you find? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth.
I was like, fossils had to have been laid down rapidly. Here we see a fish swallowing another fish. There's no way that fish died of being slowly buried over millions of years. Nothing could be fossilized by being buried over millions of years anyway. Their bodies would decompose long before the burial process was finished. And we know that carbon-14 only works up going back tens of thousands of years, not millions of years. Paleontology was all just, we know that the fossils are that old because the rocks are that old. We know that the rocks are that old because of carbon dating. We know that the carbon dating works because we know that the fossils are that old. And who even needs that circular, worthless science when we've got our homeschool educations, complete with VHS tapes featuring prominent conspiracy theorists like Ken Ham and Dennis Peterson and Kent Hovind? I've already talked a bit in other videos about the misinformation and lies that we used to keep ourselves confused about what the science actually said, so we could keep on punching down at straw man positions and congratulating ourselves that we alone were the only ones who weren't silly enough to believe that individual fossils were buried slowly over millions of years by gradually accumulating cosmic dust or some shit. The second pillar upon which my certainty rested was prophecy, how well the life of Jesus was predicted, or at least foreshadowed, by the stories and rituals in the Old Testament. Looking back on it now, of course, drawing comparisons between the Old Testament and the life of Jesus is a questionable way of proving anything, largely since we don't have any reliable stories about what the life of Jesus was even like. The best we have is 4 religious texts, written decades after the events they claim to describe, in Greek by authors who do not identify themselves by name in the texts, or claim to have witnessed the events in these stories themselves. Or, to be more accurate, we have 1 religious text written decades after the fact, and 3 other texts that were written even later, and are clearly just further embellished and more grandiose retellings of that original tale. The very idea that these texts are linked to actual eyewitnesses or contemporaries of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John specifically, is based on 2nd century Proto-Orthodox tradition that came to be incorporated into Catholicism, right along with other 2nd century Proto-Orthodox traditions that found their way into Catholicism, such as infant baptism, the notion that the brothers of Jesus were actually his half-brothers and Mary remained a virgin even after the birth of Jesus, and the Eucharist becoming the literal flesh and blood of Christ. Modern-day Protestants dismiss all of these 2nd century traditions as fabricated absurdities, except for the tradition of gospel authorship, because without that tradition, they would have to accept that their gospel message is at best a compilation of local folk tales that were cobbled together into a single narrative generations later, and that their faith is scarcely worth the minute decomposing scraps of papyrus that it is written on. I see no reason to grant that these collections of fantastical folk tales present an accurate depiction of the life of the condemned and executed faith healer known as Jesus. Just look at how misinformation is forced into the public consciousness and adopted as if it were a matter of fact today.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
This in the age of the internet, when you can debunk misinformation and propaganda in a matter of minutes. Just imagine how freely falsehoods would have propagated and grown and come to be embellished back then, when you literally had to hop on a donkey, ride for weeks, and knock on random doors and ask around to confirm or deny whether the scuttlebutt you heard at your local tavern was factual or not. But even if we were reckless enough to grant that whoever it was that compiled these fantastical folk tales somehow captured most of the details of Jesus' life correctly, even then, using prophecy to make the case that Jesus must have been the Messiah would still be an exercise in futility. Even if we grant all of the spell work and necromancy and shape-shifting, I guess, even if we grant all of the magical powers that were credited to Jesus in the gospel narratives, it does not change the fact that he still fails to live up to the prerequisite requirements that prophecy demanded of anyone who might aspire to call himself the Messiah. The Messiah was expected to be a king who would rise to power and restore the throne of David. The Messiah was expected to gather the scattered descendants of Israel together from among the nations. The Messiah was expected to be a mighty warrior who would defeat the enemies of Israel and turn the Holy Land into a utopian center of trade for all the world, where even the animals and nature itself would not dare to raise a hand to the Lord's holy chosen people. So, again, even if we grant that the gospel accounts got the story more or less right, Jesus still died without having fulfilled the prerequisite requirements for being the Messiah. The only way the followers of Jesus, who still clung to his teachings after his death, could justify him being the Messiah was to speculate that maybe his premature death was all just a part of the plan. Like, you remember how our ancestors were commanded to do all of those blood rituals and animal sacrifices? Well, maybe his death was like that. Maybe this is what all of those rituals were leading up to. Maybe all of those sacrifices were just foreshadowing for this, the ultimate sacrifice. As for the actual prophecies, the criteria by which we were meant to judge whether or not someone even qualified as being the Messiah, maybe he's coming back and he'll take care of all of those prophecies later. Maybe he had to go up to heaven first so he could get things ready and prepare a place for us. Because God couldn't be bothered to just wish the golden city into being, like he did with the whole rest of the universe. He really needed Jesus' carpentry skills to put the city together, I guess. No worries, though. I'm sure it won't take him that long to single-handedly build the golden... In hindsight, it kind of amazes me how persuasive I found the Old Testament prophecies to be in terms of validating my faith. Jesus didn't accomplish anything that the Messiah was expected to accomplish. The closest you can get to saying that he fulfilled prophecy at all is to point out that certain tropes from the Old Testament were incorporated into the Jesus narrative, which is only impressive if you presuppose that these anonymous Greek religious texts represent a fairly accurate account of Jesus' life. Yet, somehow, the fulfillment of prophecy became one of the two key pillars of my faith, right up there with Answers in Genesis pseudoscience, which brings the conversation around to the dangers of childhood indoctrination. This Jesus fulfilled the prophetic foreshadowing of the Old Testament propaganda was driven into my skull so effectively, and from such a young age, that the fact that most of the so-called prophecies that Jesus supposedly fulfilled weren't even prophecies never even occurred to me. The fact that just using the argument, Jesus fulfilled prophetic foreshadowing, presupposes that the Jesus narrative presented in the Bible is reliable, never even entered my mind. It's all just circular reasoning, based upon misrepresentations of older texts. But that doesn't stop apologists from flaunting these supposed fulfilled prophecies as if they were some sort of knockout, mic-drop argument.
Genesis 22 is where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his own son, Isaac. This, I think, is a wonderful picture of what Jesus did and what the Father did. Abraham being the father, Isaac representing Jesus. The wood is laid on the son, and Jesus carried his cross on that same hill.
When we look at Psalm 22, it would be wrong to simply just say, okay, it's not prophecy, it's David crying out to God. No, the first half of the psalm describes horrific suffering on the part of the king of Israel, who isn't supposed to suffer, but he's rejected, he's being mocked. This looks a lot like a crucifixion.
Typological interpretation, I think, is a biblical necessity. Noah's Ark and the flood was a type of Christian baptism, because the Apostle Peter says that it was a type of Christian baptism.
When apologists make the claim that they have evidence that Jesus was the Messiah in the form of fulfilled prophecy, they are exclusively referring to one of two things. They are either referring to something that only counts as a fulfillment of prophecy if you already presuppose that the more fanciful elements of the Jesus narrative actually happened, for example, Isaiah 53, or they are referring to a text that was only ever about something else entirely, such as Daniel chapter 9. But who cares what Doug Wilson believes? What does it really matter if this adorable teddy bear of a man wants to believe things that are not evidently true and are evidently not true? Why should I care? It's not as if his beliefs were hurting anything.
Is anal intercourse, among other things, fruitless. America has enslaved herself to the terrible bondage of orgasms without consequences.
When women were granted the right to vote, the nation had already accepted the lie that a nation is nothing more than a collection of individuals.
The suffrage movement was actually not taking up the cause of women, but rather was part of a long-sustained war on the family.
In the republic I envision, Hindus would not be able to hold political office. In the Christian nationalist project, we don't want this smudge or hodgepodge. We want it to be explicitly Christian.
Let's say a Muslim moved here, and let's say he was allowed to green card it, and he was settled down here. In the ideal setup, he couldn't hold office. He could, because we're a Christian nation, and he's not a Christian.
The president could issue a proclamation that acknowledged that Jesus rose from the dead, and Congress could authorize the funds to have that proclamation printed and bound, read in all the schools, and posted in all the federal courthouses. That could be fun. Or the Apostles' Creed could be incorporated into the Constitution. All the nations of men are to be brought into submission to Christ. Is there any possible way to seek to make America a Christian nation without drawing the charge of Christian nationalism? No, there's no way to do this without drawing that charge. Should we care about this? Not even a little bit.
But Doug Wilson is just some wackadoodle nobody, right? It's not as if what he has to say has any bearing on actual policy in the United States. Oh shit, he was a featured speaker at NatCon? This radical cult leader was a guest speaker on the same stage and at the same event as Tulsi Gabbard, the United States Director of National Intelligence. The same event the Director of the Office of Management and Budget and Project 2025 architect Russell Vaught spoke at, along with border czar Tom Homan, as well as President of the Heritage Foundation Kevin Roberts, and no less than 3 Republican senators. This is why the warped epistemology of a random wackadoodle like Doug Wilson is worth talking about. Because as much as one would like to think that Christian nationalism is still just a fringe movement of laughably irrelevant conspiracy theorists, these conspiracy theorists have succeeded in positioning themselves in positions of power. You recall what I said earlier about how dangerous childhood indoctrination is? Christian nationalists intend, by their own admission, to abolish separation of church and state, and they demand access to our children, to raise them in the faith of their choosing. They intend, by their own admission, to strip non-Christians of freedom of speech and to make them second-class citizens. Some of these conspirators have already gained positions of power in the government, and a lot of politicians have gotten in bed with these people, furthering their Christian nationalist agenda in exchange for megapastors endorsing them and urging their congregations to vote for them as a bloc.
Who likes the 10 Commandments, by the way, going up in the schools? They think it's such a bad thing. I said, has anyone read the "Thou shalt not steal, thou shalt..." I mean, has anybody read this incredible stuff? It's just incredible.
So we will be issuing a memo today that every school district will adhere to, which is that every teacher, every classroom in the state will have a Bible in the classroom and will be teaching from the Bible in the classroom.
What if Jesus showed up today and said, from this point forward, everything you say, you will have it? He said it. That's exactly what he said to us. Are we going to declare that God removes these unrighteous politicians, these corrupt, crooked politicians, and installs righteous men and women of God?
But really, it is, it's a satanic tool of evil.
And this is the beginning, and they use the word right there, which is still with us today and more robust than it's ever been. Democracy.
Yes.
They did it all under the word democracy, which is a word our founders blatantly rejected.
As being completely dangerous.
Dangerous, the tyranny of the majority.
Yep.
Without sharing, too many details or names, it is a fact that people, massively influential people, high up, and it's not just that we have a speculation. No, they are calling us, texting us. You can keep patting yourself on the back and consoling yourself. Christian nationalism will go away. It will go away. It won't.
I wish I could just be like, oh, how cute. People are out here believing things that are not evidently true. Isn't that adorable? How quaint. How endearing. But I can't do that. Corrupt people are weaponizing that credulity, campaigning on it, and it's leading to real-world consequences. Make no mistake about it. Paula White does not think that she was physically teleported into the throne room of heaven. Nor does Donald Trump think that not allowing Christian nationalists to indoctrinate our children is a form of persecution brought about by anti-Christian bias. These are not sincere beliefs held by sincere people. These are con artists who know that they have nothing to offer reasonable people, so they have devoted their energies instead to appealing to unreasonable people. And they know that the scam they are running is so ludicrous that they can't keep pulling it off forever, not without the forced indoctrination of children, without grooming the next generation while their minds are still at their most vulnerable. All of that to say, while all of this talk about prophecy might seem silly, it's important that we take the time to talk about it, because people are being taken in by this scam. Hell, I was taken in by it for most of my life. And it's from here, from talking about insincere people and the importance of calling them out on their lies, that we are going to segue back into the subject of the Gospels, specifically the Gospel of Matthew. While all 4 of the canonical Gospels attempt to make the case that Jesus fulfilled prophecy, the Gospel of Matthew stands apart as being particularly ludicrous and disingenuous. So let's dust off our Bibles and dive into this dumpster. The first thing we see when we open up the book of Matthew is this shit, this infamous genealogy. I say infamous because of how problematic it is and how much debate and desperate apologetics have been centered around it over the years. It's fucked up in so many ways that it really warrants its own separate video, but this isn't what we're here to talk about today, so we're just going to hitch up our britches and plow through this shit. Here, at the end of the genealogy, we read, Thus there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. 14, 14, and 14. Nice pairs of 7, resulting in a grand total of 6 sevens, or 42. It's all very poetic and neat. But if we add up the generations in this list, we only get a total of 41 names. We must have lost somebody. But it's okay, they're not lost. They're over here, bringing the number up to 44 generations. No matter how you slice it, even if you stick the names that the author omitted back in, it still doesn't add up to 42 generations. Clearly, he just wanted to say it was 42 generations because 7 and 6 are symbolically significant numbers, and using them adds a sense of mystique and purpose to Jesus' origin story. But in spite of the fact that he took all of these liberties with the king's list and was willing to play fast and loose with the numbers to make his point, he still didn't manage to come up with a list of 42 names. The next thing that's unusual about this genealogy is that this is the genealogy of Joseph. And in the next half of this chapter, they explain how Jesus wasn't really Joseph's son anyway. It's also quite different from the genealogy given in the Gospel of Luke. Who gives a shit? Well, if you believe in biblical inerrancy, as I used to, then it kind of makes a big difference. Some people have attempted to explain the difference between Matthew's genealogy and Luke's genealogy by claiming that one of them is the genealogy of Jesus through Joseph, and the other is the genealogy of Jesus through Mary. 2 genealogies, one showing that he is the legal heir to the throne of David via adoption and legal father-to-son inheritance, and the other showing that he is connected to the throne by blood. It would be a nice, tidy explanation if they didn't both claim to be the genealogies of Joseph. And there are excuses and apologetics where people have tied themselves up into knots in an effort to explain why what the verses say is not what they mean. Like I said, I could almost make a video about this genealogy alone, but this isn't why we're here. We're here to talk about prophecy in Matthew, and our first one comes up later in the same chapter, down around verse 23. All of this took place, all of this referring to an angel showing up and telling Joseph that God had knocked up his fiancée and the kid was going to grow up to save his people from their sins. All of this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. I would like to draw your attention to the tiny letter G at the end of the quote there. If you are following along at home, you should see a similar footnote in your own Bible. If we follow it on down, it gives us the location of the original quote that the author of Matthew is quoting. We see here that the quote comes from Isaiah 7:14. So let's turn there real quick. Isaiah 7:14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. Quick side note here. While the Greek word used in the Gospel of Matthew, parthenos, does unambiguously mean virgin, the original word that the author of Matthew is quoting, in Isaiah, is the Hebrew word alma. Alma literally translates to young woman or newlywed, and while virginity is strongly implied by alma, particularly in the time and place in which this text was written, a time in which, generally speaking, to be a young unwed girl was to be a virgin, virgin is not as literal of a translation as it is in the case of the Greek word parthenos. A less ambiguous Hebrew word for virgin that the author of Isaiah could have used would have been bethulah. But he didn't, because that's not what he meant, because Isaiah chapter 7 is not a story about a miraculous conception. However you want to translate the Hebrew word alma, the fact is that the passage in Isaiah is not prophesying about the Messiah. This one part of a verse that the author of Matthew plucked out of context is but one line in a larger narrative, about how the king of Judah was invaded by the Syrians and the Ephraimites. Ahaz, the king of Judah, was terrified, so Isaiah the prophet went to reassure the king with this message. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The Alma, the virgin or the young woman, will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. He will be eating curds and honey when he knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right. For before the boy knows enough to reject the wrong and choose the right, the land of the 2 kings you dread will be laid waste. This was a prophecy relating to events that transpired in a narrative set 700 years before Jesus was born. The prophet Isaiah is assuring King Ahaz that the 2 nations that he is so afraid of, Yahweh is about to deal with them in short order. How short? So short that by the time a girl conceives and gives birth and the baby is old enough to eat solid foods and know the difference between right and wrong, those 2 armies will have been destroyed. Was the young girl or newlywed, or however you want to translate it, a specific person? Or was the girl, along with the baby, just a poetic way of conveying an approximate span of time? Rather like if one were to say, the robin will lay an egg and by the time the fledgling hatches and learns to fly, yada yada. Not talking about a specific robin, but more about springtime and summertime and the changing of the seasons. Some commentators have suggested that the girl in question may have been Isaiah's wife, and that the baby may have been Isaiah's son. Whether there was a specific girl who gave birth to a specific child, or whether the whole thing was just a poetic way of saying, the war will be over in a few years, either way, this prophecy was a part of a story in which a sign was given to the king of Judah, for his benefit, in his own lifetime, 700 years before the birth of Christ. It only serves as evidence of the divinity of Jesus if you take it out of context, pretend that it was a prophecy about the distant future relative to when it was written, and presuppose that Jesus was born of a virgin. You have to assume his divinity for this prophecy to count as evidence of his divinity. Moving on, we come to my personal favorite, the one that inspired me to make this video about prophecy in the first place. Joseph, Mary, and the baby Jesus flee to Egypt to hide out until the death of Herod, to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Now, not for nothing, Matthew's is the only gospel that has this story about them running off to hide in Egypt. Curious, that. But putting that aside for now, we have a little footnote here. We follow that down, and we see that this quote was pulled from Hosea 11. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. This is one of the laziest, most dishonest things I have ever seen in the entire Bible. This passage from Hosea isn't even a prophecy, let alone a messianic prophecy. The author of Matthew was so desperate to make connections between the Jesus narrative and the Old Testament prophecies, and to prove that even if Jesus didn't fulfill the prerequisite requirements of being the Messiah, he still fulfilled something, right? That he is just straight up lying now, if not to his readers, then to himself. One more. We're skipping ahead quite a bit, but the video is already getting to be quite long, and we can't close things out without addressing this little nugget right here. Matthew 27. Verses 6 through 10. This is right after Judas betrays Jesus for the 30 pieces of silver. According to Matthew, anyway. None of the other Gospels mention the 30 pieces of silver. And Judas felt guilty about what he had done, so he went back to the priests and the elders and threw the silver at their feet. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money." So they decided to use the money to buy the potter's field as a burial place for foreigners. That is why it has been called the field of blood to this day. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price set on him by the people of Israel, and they used them to buy the potter's field, as the Lord commanded me. Following the footnote once more, this prophecy appears to have been pulled from the middle of a rather long, brutal rant in which the prophet refers to the children of Israel as a flock marked for slaughter, and he complains about how he doesn't want to deal with their shit anymore, and he asks them to pay him, I guess? It's kind of hard to tell, actually, whether the asking for pay is a thing that happened in the narrative, or if it's part of the cryptic prophetic rant. Anyway, they pay him 30 pieces of silver. And the prophet is pissed off, evidently, about being paid such a small amount, and the Lord tells him to just throw the money away. The passage reads, "I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they valued me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter at the house of the Lord." That is the closest match to the quote given in Matthew that is to be found in the Old Testament. Not only did the author of Matthew fuck it up 3 ways from Sunday, but what kind of mental gymnastics is this? Taking that one little piece of this long, convoluted rant about how we're all doomed and how being a prophet of the Lord don't pay all that well, and then he takes that, wraps it all up in a pretzel, and tells us that it was a messianic prophecy all along? Because of what? Because of 30 pieces of silver that none of the other gospel authors even bothered to mention? Because of the fact that the money was thrown and it ended up going to a potter? Not only is that an incredible stretch, but consider this. Not only did all of the other Gospels leave out this potter's field story, it directly contradicts details from a story from Acts chapter 1. But the real reason I wanted to include this prophecy in particular is, look at this. Then what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. This quote isn't from the prophet Jeremiah. It's from the prophet Zechariah. That is how lazy and unserious this motherfucker was. He was just plucking scriptures out of context, looking for anything that reminded him of the Jesus story, and if it didn't remind him of anything in the Jesus story, he just made some shit up, called it good enough, and didn't even check his sources to make sure that he got the shit right. And Christian apologetics hasn't gotten much better since then. That's about it for this video. I've been wanting to make this video for a while, ever since I came across that "out of Egypt I have called my son" passage in Matthew chapter 2. In hindsight, it's amazing. I read through the entire Bible a few times when I was a believer, and I don't even know how many times I read through the book of Matthew specifically. And through all of that, it never even occurred to me how absurd something like this was. The closest thing to shock over the bad apologetics of Matthew that I ever experienced was all in terms of feeling a sense of awe at how much deep, multi-layered meaning the divinely inspired authors of the Bible were able to express in a few words. The idea that the author of Matthew might have been talking out of his ass never even entered my mind. It never occurred to me that, even though traditionally the authorship of this gospel is credited to Matthew the tax collector, not only does the author never identify himself as such in the text, but the text is in fact written from the perspective of an omnipresent storyteller, recording exact lines of dialogue and prayers that Jesus uttered in private, which Matthew the tax collector wouldn't have been around to witness. Yet, the kind of low-tier apologetics that we find in the book of Matthew used to be one of the 2 pillars upon which the certainty of my religious convictions rested. Even after I started to see through the pseudoscience of answers in Genesis, I still couldn't let go of the New Testament and my faith in Jesus for years after that. I still felt that prophecy made for a compelling argument for the accuracy of the narratives presented in the gospel accounts. Of course, looking back on it now, there's not even an argument there to be made. But this concept, this notion that we know Jesus was the Christ because he fulfilled prophecy, was instilled in me since before I can remember, and repeating it to myself came to me as easily and thoughtlessly as breathing. To question it, to even entertain the notion that it might not be so, was a scary little thing we called doubting. We believed that no matter what you've done, no matter how depraved the sin, God is still going to love you. There were only 2 sins that God could never forgive: blaspheming the Holy Spirit and disbelief. So, if the smallest sliver of doubt ever crept its way into my mind, then, oh fuck, my soul is in a state of uncertainty. If I were to die right now with this doubt in my mind, is God going to send me to hell? Quick, stamp it out! Go watch some more Answers in Genesis, or read Isaiah 7. What chance do we even have? when, from before we are old enough to even tell the difference between ice cream and frozen yogurt, they are drumming misinformation into our pliant, supple little skulls, and telling us that having critical thoughts puts us at risk of being tortured forever, and that is what the purest form of love looks like. If you're an adult, and you decide of your own free will that you want to make believe things that are not evidently true, if that's what makes you happy, then you're welcome to tell yourself whatever you want, so long as you keep your eccentricities out of our government. But when insincere people start trying to replace our secular government with a theocracy, under the leadership of a known sexual predator and rapist, and trying to get their perverted, grooming little mitts on our children, that is when the onus is on us, to undermine, defy, and resist these motherfuckers, to our last breath. If you are an adult, and you decide of your own free will, and you decide of your own free will that you want to make believe things, oh boy. If you're an adult, and you decide of your own free will that you want to make believe things, oh my god, why can't I speak? And you decide of your own free will that you want to make believe things that are not evidently true, if that what makes you happy, oh my god.